It was an ordinary afternoon. The kind that Mike Reynolds had grown accustomed to in his retirement. He had spent nearly 4 decades as a firefighter, putting out fires, saving lives, and facing danger head-on. The noise of sirens, the rush of adrenaline, and the heat of the flames were long behind him now. But even in retirement, the thrill of helping people, the satisfaction of doing a job well done, lingered in his mind. Mike had always been a strong man, physically and emotionally. At 62, his frame was still solid, his shoulders broad from years of carrying heavy equipment, his posture straight from the discipline of his firehouse days. But the years had also given him wisdom, a calm, steady nature that had made him a wonderful husband to Linda and a proud father to Anna. His life, though not without its struggles, had been full of love and purpose. Linda was the perfect partner for him. They had been together for over 30 years, weathering the storms of life side by side. She had always been the one to keep things steady when life threatened to get too overwhelming. Their daughter, Anna, was everything they had hoped for: bright, compassionate, and determined. As a young doctor, she had already made her mark in the medical field, and Mike couldn't have been prouder of her. Their home had always been a place of warmth, laughter, and togetherness. And there, too, was Cooper, the loyal Labrador retriever. Mike had brought Cooper into their lives when he was a puppy. A few years after he retired from the fire department, Cooper had been his constant companion, following him through every high and low, providing comfort when Mike's body ached after long days and offering companionship when the silence of retirement felt deafening. It was on this ordinary afternoon, however, that everything would change. Mike had been sitting in his favorite chair by the window, reading a book, the faint rustling of Cooper's paws the only sound breaking the silence. The weather outside was calm, the sun low in the sky, casting a warm orange glow across the room. Linda was in the kitchen, humming as she prepared dinner, and Anna was finishing up a shift at the hospital. All was peaceful, and Mike had never felt more content. But then, without warning, it happened. Mike suddenly felt a sharp pain shoot through his head, followed by an overwhelming sense of dizziness. The book slipped from his hands, landing softly on the floor, and his vision blurred. Before he could even reach for the armrest of the chair to steady himself, everything went dark. Cooper barked, sensing something was wrong. He paced anxiously around Mike's motionless body, nipping at his hands, but there was no response. Linda rushed in from the kitchen at the sound of the dog's frantic barking. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw Mike slumped in the chair, his face pale, his breathing shallow. She ran to him, shaking him gently, calling his name, but he didn't stir. Panic surged through her chest as she grabbed her phone, dialing Anna's number, but it went straight to voicemail. "Mike," Linda cried, her voice cracking as she dropped to her knees beside him. Cooper whined, standing by her side, his tail tucked between his legs. Without hesitation, she grabbed the phone again, calling 911. "Help, my husband's collapsed. I think he's having a stroke." In what felt like an eternity, but was only a matter of minutes, the ambulance arrived. the paramedics rushing in to take control. They checked Mike's vitals, but he remained unresponsive. Cooper's bark echoed in the background as they carefully loaded Mike onto the stretcher. Linda followed the ambulance in her car, her heart pounding in her chest. Unsure of what awaited her. She could hardly breathe, the weight of fear pressing down on her like a stone. At the hospital, the doctors worked swiftly, hooking Mike up to machines and performing tests. Anna arrived shortly after, her face pale as she rushed to her mother's side. "What happened?" she asked breathlessly, her hands trembling as she took Linda's. "We don't know," Linda replied, her voice shaking. "He just collapsed. I don't know what's happening." The doctors spoke to them in quiet, serious tones, explaining that Mike had suffered a severe stroke, likely caused by a clot in his brain. They told Linda and Anna that he was in a deep coma, and his chances of recovering were very slim. The damage to his brain was extensive, and even if he did wake up, the doctor said, he might not be the man he once was. "How long will he be like this?" Linda asked, her voice breaking. "We can't say," the doctor replied gently. "We'll monitor him closely, but right now, we can't predict the outcome." The next few days were a blur of uncertainty. Linda never left Mike's side, sitting by his bed, holding his hand, praying for a miracle. Anna visited every day, her medical knowledge providing some comfort in a sea of unknowns. But even she couldn't answer the questions that kept running through their minds. Would he wake up? And if he did, would he remember them? Would he be the strong, loving husband and father they knew and loved? Or would he be someone different, someone they didn't recognize? Cooper, too, seemed to know something was wrong. He sat quietly by Mike's bedside, his eyes fixed on the man who had been his constant companion for over a decade. The dog's usual energy had disappeared, replaced by a quiet sadness that seemed to match the somber mood in the room. Linda often found herself talking to Mike. Even though she knew he couldn't hear her, she'd tell him about the small things, the things he loved, the things he had promised her they would do when he recovered. She told him about the garden, the way the roses were blooming outside the window. She told him that Anna was doing well at the hospital, that Cooper was still waiting for him, and that she couldn't wait for him to come home. Days turned into weeks, and then, one morning, something miraculous happened. Mike's fingers twitched. Linda was by his side as always, her hand resting gently on his. At first, she thought it was her imagination. But then it happened again. His eyelids fluttered, his chest rose and fell in a deeper, steadier rhythm. "Mike," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. And then, as if responding to her voice, Mike's eyes slowly opened. It wasn't a dramatic awakening, but it was enough. He blinked several times, as if trying to focus, and then his gaze met Linda's. A faint, exhausted smile spread across his face. "Linda," he whispered hoarsely. "Linda, I'm here." Tears filled Linda's eyes as she leaned forward, brushing his hair from his forehead. "You're here," she said softly, "you're here." And in that moment, she knew that no matter how long the road ahead might be, Mike was coming back to her. He was coming back to their family. It wouldn't be easy, But together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. And through it all, Cooper would be by their side. Loyal as ever. The days at the hospital felt endless. Linda and Anna stood vigil by Mike's bedside, watching him lying still, his once strong body now vulnerable and frail. Machines beeped softly, each sound a constant reminder of the fragile thread that held him to this world. Mike, the man who had always been the rock of their family, the one who had been so full of life and strength, was now a mere shadow of himself. His chest rose and fell with the rhythm of the ventilator, but there was no sign of awareness, no indication that he knew they were there. It was a cruel irony. Linda had spent years by his side, helping him through everything, from the terrifying days of his firefighting career to the quieter days of their retirement. And now, she found herself waiting in the sterile silence of the hospital, hoping for a miracle that seemed more and more distant with each passing day. Anna, her face pale and tired from weeks of sleepless nights, kept her professional demeanor, but Linda could see the struggle in her daughter's eyes. As a doctor, Anna knew the statistics, knew the prognosis, but as a daughter, she was just as desperate to see her father wake up as her mother was. The doctors had been clear. Mike's condition wasn't improving. He hadn't shown any signs of progress, even after weeks of care. The doctors gently broached the subject of withdrawing life support. "We understand how difficult this is. But after such a long time with no improvement, we may need to consider all options," one of the doctors said softly. "It may be time to make some hard decisions." Linda couldn't bring herself to even think about it. She refused to believe that the man who had fought fires, who had fought for his family all his life, would simply give up. Every day, she clung to the hope that one morning, Mike would open his eyes, smile that familiar, comforting smile, and tell them that everything would be okay. Anna, too, was torn. She knew her father's body was failing him, but as a doctor, she also understood the reality of the situation. She could see the toll it was taking on Linda. Her mother hadn't left his side for weeks, hadn't even taken a proper rest. Anna had insisted on trying to get her to eat and sleep. But Linda's heart was still with Mike, by his side in the sterile, emotionless room. They were caught in a limbo, neither of them ready to let go. And yet they couldn't ignore the painful truth that they might soon have to. Meanwhile, Cooper seemed to understand something was terribly wrong. The loyal Labrador retriever, who had once filled their home with energy and joy, had become a mere shadow of his former self. He refused to leave the front door of Mike's hospital room, lying silently on the floor just outside, his nose pressed against the cool tiles. His coat, once gleaming white, seemed duller, and his movements were slower, more deliberate. He hadn't eaten a meal in days. He had become a quiet, watchful sentinel, his eyes never leaving the door as if waiting for Mike to return. Linda had tried to get Cooper to eat, to coax him back to his old self. But he wouldn't budge. "He knows, Mom," Anna said one day, looking down at the dog. "He knows that Dad's not okay. He's waiting for him." Linda's heart ached as she watched Cooper's loyal eyes follow her every movement. The dog's devotion to Mike, even in his current state, was a testament to the deep bond they had shared over the years. Cooper had been by Mike's side through thick and thin. Through retirement and the quieter years that followed. He had been his constant companion, his confidant, and his friend. And now, as Mike lay in a hospital bed, Cooper refused to leave, unwilling to part from the man who had always been there for him. One day, after yet another painful conversation with the doctors, Linda found herself sitting in the hospital cafeteria, her head in her hands, overwhelmed with the weight of the decisions that loomed ahead. Anna had gone home for a brief rest, but Linda couldn't bring herself to leave Mike's side. As she sat there, staring at her coffee cup, she remembered a moment from years ago, when Mike had been in the hospital after a minor accident. Cooper had been right there with him then, wagging his tail, and Mike had insisted that he be brought in to visit. The joy that filled the room when Cooper bounded through the door, tail wagging, was something Linda would never forget. Suddenly, an idea took root in her mind. One that had been growing quietly in the back of her thoughts for days. She couldn't bear to leave Mike. But what if Cooper could be there with him? Just for a moment, to remind him of the life he had outside this sterile room. What if the familiar presence of his old friend could somehow reach him? Even if only for a brief second. Linda stood up, her decision made. She walked to the nurse's station and explained her request. Her voice soft but resolute. "I'd like to bring Cooper in to see Mike. Just for a few minutes. Please. It might help him. It might help us." The nurse looked at her, considering the request. After a long moment, she nodded. "I think that's a good idea. Let me make arrangements." A few minutes later, Linda was leading Cooper into the room. The dog's tail was low, his eyes heavy with sadness. But there was still a glimmer of hope in him as he entered the room. The moment Cooper laid eyes on Mike's still form, his body froze for a split second. Then, slowly, he padded over to the bed, his nose sniffing the air. Linda held her breath as Cooper gently placed his head on Mike's hand. As if trying to feel any sign of life, the dog's ears perked up as he rested there, waiting, his body trembling with what seemed like anticipation. It was then that something incredible happened. A small sound escaped Mike's lips. A faint noise that caused Linda's heart to skip a beat. She moved closer, whispering his name. "Mike, Mike, can you hear me?" For the first time in weeks, Mike's fingers twitched. Cooper's head lifted at the same moment, his tail giving the slightest wag. Linda's breath caught in her throat as Mike's eyelids fluttered open. Just a crack. His eyes were unfocused at first. But when they landed on Cooper, they softened. His hand moved weakly, resting on the dog's head. A tear slipped down Linda's cheek as she whispered, "Mike, it's me, it's Linda. You're not alone." The small movement, the flutter of recognition, was all she needed. It was a sign, a flicker of hope. She knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end. Cooper had reminded him of what he had to fight for: the family, the love, the life he had built. And with that, Linda knew they weren't giving up. Not yet. Cooper was led into the room quietly, his steps slower than usual, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. Normally, the moment he entered a room, He would rush excitedly toward the person he loved most, Mike, but today his movements were deliberate, measured. The usual spark in his eyes had dimmed, and his tail hung limply behind him, not wagging with the joy it once did. Linda watched, her heart heavy, as Cooper hesitated at the foot of Mike's bed. He looked up at her, then at Mike, his gaze filled with a quiet understanding. For the past several days, the dog had been so subdued, so different, as if he had somehow already known the battle Mike was facing. But now, as he slowly approached the bed, Linda felt a sense of anticipation, the kind that you can't explain but simply know to be true. Cooper sniffed at Mike's hand first, then gently pressed his nose against the man's wrist, as if trying to catch any sign of life beneath the cool skin. The dog's movements were tender, careful, as if he knew Mike's fragile state and didn't want to disturb him. Then, without a sound, Cooper laid his head on Mike's chest, just over the spot where his heart had always beat strong and steady. Linda stood at the foot of the bed, her eyes brimming with tears. Cooper had always been a force of nature, bounding around the house, full of energy, but now he was still, resting his head where Mike's heartbeat had once been. There was no barking, no wagging of the tail, only the soft sound of Cooper's breathing as he settled next to Mike. It was as if he were listening, waiting for something that might never come, but still hopeful, still loyal. Minutes passed. Linda couldn't help but hold her breath as she watched the scene unfold. Cooper's presence in the room, his steady companionship, felt like a prayer, a silent offering of love and hope. She felt in that moment that perhaps there was something more at play here. Something beyond their understanding. The bond between Mike and Cooper had always been strong, but now it felt as if the dog was doing something more, something almost sacred. The nurses had been kind, letting Cooper stay longer than they typically would, understanding the depth of the connection between the two. But as time dragged on, one of the nurses gently approached Linda and said, "It's time to bring him out now. We've exceeded the visiting time." She spoke in a soft tone, not wanting to disturb the delicate atmosphere that had filled the room. Linda nodded, but a deep, unspoken part of her wasn't ready. She wasn't ready to say goodbye, not yet. Just as the nurse moved toward Cooper to guide him away, something extraordinary happened. Cooper's ears perked up, his head snapped up from Mike's chest, and his eyes widened as if he had just heard something, a faint noise. A breath, a whisper from beyond the veil. His tail, which had been still, suddenly twitched, and before anyone could react, Cooper leapt onto the bed with a sudden burst of energy. His nose touched Mike's face, nudging his cheek gently, as if trying to wake him from the deep slumber. The dog's breath came in short bursts, his body trembling with emotion as he barked once. Then again, louder this time, with all the strength he could muster. It was a bark full of urgency, a bark that seemed to demand attention. The room fell completely silent. The nurses froze, their eyes wide, unsure of what to make of Cooper's sudden outburst. Linda's heart stopped in her chest, and for a brief moment, she wondered if she had imagined it. But then, The monitors attached to Mike's body gave a faint, erratic beep. Linda's eyes flew to the heart monitor, her breath catching in her throat. The steady line that had once been flat was now beginning to flicker with life again. The heart rate, once so weak, began to pulse more steadily. Linda grabbed Mike's hand, her grip tight, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Mike, can you hear me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Cooper, still at Mike's side, let out another bark, this one more insistent, almost as if he were encouraging Mike to return, to fight. The monitor continued to pulse with more strength, the beeping becoming more rhythmic, more consistent. The faintest twitch of Mike's fingers was enough to send Linda into a rush of emotion. It was so small, so subtle, but it was enough to break through the fear and doubt that had settled in her chest. "Mike," Linda whispered again, tears streaming down her face. "Please, Mike, can you hear me? Please come back to us." There was a long silence, one that felt as though time itself had paused. Linda held her breath, willing with every fiber of her being for Mike to respond, for him to come back from the edge. And then, it happened. A soft, almost imperceptible groan escaped Mike's lips, a sound so faint that Linda wasn't sure she had heard it at first. But then, his fingers twitched again. This time, they moved a little more deliberately, slowly reaching out, as though trying to make contact with the world around him. Linda's heart leapt in her chest. She leaned closer, not daring to breathe as she waited for any sign, any proof that her husband was returning to them. "Mike, it's Linda. You're not alone. Mike, we're here." For a moment, there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the machines and the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. And then, to Linda's amazement, Mike's hand moved slightly, his fingers curling ever so slightly. The tears spilled down Linda's face, her heart swelling with the overwhelming relief of seeing the signs of life she had longed for. She leaned forward, her voice cracking. "Mike, sweetheart, can you hear me? Please, just give me a sign. Please come back to us." And then, it came, a small groan, barely audible, followed by the gentle shift of Mike's head on the pillow. His eyelids fluttered open, just a crack, and his eyes, though unfocused, met Linda's. His lips parted, and he whispered, so softly it was almost a breath. "Linda." Linda gasped, her heart soaring. "Mike, you're awake. You're here." Cooper, who had been sitting still beside Mike's bed, watched the exchange with an expression of quiet triumph. The dog's tail wagged once, just slightly, and he gave a soft whine, as if content in the knowledge that Mike had finally returned to them. Cooper had done it. He had brought Mike back. The miracle had happened. The doctors stood in disbelief, their eyes scanning the machines and monitors as the numbers slowly shifted. For days, the readings had remained unchanged, static, unyielding, a grim reminder of the situation they all faced. But now, something was different. The heart rate, which had been faint and erratic, began to show signs of stability. The oxygen levels, which had once been so low, were gradually rising. One of the doctors leaned in closer to the monitor, his hand hovering over the buttons. unsure if he was seeing things correctly. This can't be right," he muttered under his breath. "His vitals are improving on their own. There's no medical explanation for this." Across the room, Linda clutched Mike's hand, her eyes fixed on his face, watching for any sign, any movement that would tell her he was coming back. It had been weeks of uncertainty, of hope and fear tangled together. But now, as the heart monitor beeped steadily, she felt the first flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: hope. Cooper, the faithful dog who had never left Mike's side, sat beside the bed, his gaze fixed intently on the man who had always been his best friend. His tail gave a slow, tentative wag, but there was an almost palpable tension in his body, as if he knew something was about to change. With a soft whine, Cooper leaned closer to Mike, pressing his nose gently against his hand, as though urging him to wake up. His eyes were filled with an emotion too deep for words: concern, love, loyalty. The dog had been through so much, had waited for this moment longer than anyone could understand. But now, as the heart monitor's steady rhythm continued, there was a quiet expectation in the room, a sense that the impossible was beginning to unfold. Then, in a moment that seemed to freeze time, Mike's eyelids fluttered. It was a faint movement at first, just the smallest hint of awareness. Linda's breath caught in her throat as she watched, heart pounding, praying that this was real. The seconds stretched on as if they were hours. But then, Mike's eyes opened fully. They were clouded at first, unfocused, and Linda thought for a moment that he might slip away again. But then his eyes found her. And in that moment, Linda's heart soared. The first thing Mike saw, after the blur of the room and the sterile white lights above him, was Cooper's face. The dog's wide brown eyes stared at him, filled with an intensity that Mike could only describe as pure love. Cooper's ears were perked, and his tail wagged, though it was slow and gentle, as if even the dog didn't want to disturb the fragile moment. Mike's throat felt dry, but he managed to speak, his voice hoarse and weak. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, his voice gravelly. "You waiting for me, huh?" Cooper's response was immediate. He gave a soft, excited whimper and licked Mike's hand, his tail thumping the bed with joy. The dog's eyes were full of relief, as if he had been holding his breath for this very moment. Linda could hardly believe her eyes. She let out a sob, the tears falling freely now. "Mike," she whispered through her tears. "Oh, Mike, you're awake. You're really awake." She leaned over him, her arms trembling as she pulled him into a tight embrace. Mike, weak but aware of her presence, rested his hand on her arm. He didn't have the strength to speak more than a few words, but the love in his touch was enough. Anna, who had been standing in the doorway, her face a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief, stepped closer, unsure of what she was witnessing. She had been there through it all, countless tests, long hours, and the painful uncertainty of whether her father would ever wake up. But now, as she watched him slowly blink, as he made contact with his wife and dog, her heart raced. Was this really happening? Her gaze shifted to the doctor standing next to her. who had been watching the entire exchange in stunned silence. He leaned in and whispered, almost as if speaking to himself, "This can't be. This is a miracle." Anna nodded, her voice breaking. "It's a miracle, isn't it?" The doctor didn't answer, but his face told her everything. This was beyond the realm of medical explanation. There was no way to account for what was happening. The prognosis had been so grim. And yet here they were, witnessing something no one could have predicted. Mike's hand trembled as he reached up, slowly brushing his fingers against Linda's cheek. His touch was weak, but it was there, and that was enough. "I'm here, Linda," he whispered, his voice barely audible, but full of the reassurance she so desperately needed. "I'm here," Linda cried out in relief, her arms tightening around him, not wanting to let go. "Mike, I've missed you so much," she said through her tears, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought I'd lost you. I didn't know if I'd ever get you back." Mike smiled faintly, his eyes soft with love. "I'm not going anywhere," he murmured, his voice rough. "I'm not done yet." Cooper, still sitting by the bed, let out a contented sigh and laid his head down on Mike's foot, as if to say, "I knew you'd come back." His tail gave one last, slow wag, and for the first time in weeks, the room felt light again. The weight of fear and uncertainty that had hung in the air for so long seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet sense of peace and relief. For Linda and Anna, this moment was everything. It was the culmination of weeks of grief, of hope, of fear, and now it was the beginning of something new. Mike was awake. He was alive. The fight was not over. The doctors, who had been quietly watching the scene unfold, exchanged looks of amazement. They had seen many cases, some hopeful, some heartbreaking, but this was something none of them had expected. They had prepared Linda and Anna for the worst. And yet here was Mike, defying all the odds. Mike's breathing was still shallow, and his body was weak, but his spirit was unmistakably strong. "Cooper," he whispered, his hand reaching down to stroke the dog's fur. "You stuck with me, buddy." Cooper let out another soft whine, his eyes sparkling with an almost knowing affection. The bond between them, built over years of companionship, had never wavered, not even in the face of the unimaginable. And for Linda, for Anna, for everyone who had witnessed this incredible moment, it was a reminder that love, hope, and faith had the power to overcome even the greatest of challenges. It was a miracle, and it was one they would never forget. Mike's recovery was slow, but it was a journey that felt like a miracle with each passing day. After months of physical therapy, speech therapy, and countless hours of hard work, he was beginning to reclaim the life he had once known. It wasn't easy. His body had been weakened by the stroke, and the simple acts of speaking or moving were once again foreign to him. Yet, through all the pain, all the frustration, there was one constant by his side: Cooper. Linda and Anna were there every step of the way, helping him with the exercises, encouraging him when he faltered, and celebrating even the smallest victories. But Cooper was different. The dog had not left his side since the day he had fallen into the coma. He had been a quiet presence in the room, a reminder of the love and loyalty that had always been there, even when Mike couldn't see it. And as Mike struggled to find his strength again, Cooper was his silent partner, offering comfort, encouragement, and companionship, day in and day out. Every morning, Cooper would lie beside Mike's bed, his head resting gently on the mattress, watching his every move. Every time Mike made even the slightest attempt to speak or move, Cooper was there, nudging his hand or licking his fingers as if to say, "Come on, you can do it." The dog never tired, never complained. He simply kept his vigil, his devotion unwavering. Mike couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude for his loyal friend. In the hardest moments, when it felt like his body might betray him, Cooper's steady presence gave him the strength to push forward. It was as if the dog was telling him, "I'm not giving up on you, so don't you give up on yourself." And, little by little, Mike began to improve. His speech, though slow at first, returned. His movements, though stiff, became more fluid. He took his first steps with the help of his therapists. And while they were unsteady, they were steps toward the life he had almost lost. Every victory, no matter how small, felt like a triumph. And with each step forward, Cooper was there, watching with pride. One afternoon, after weeks of grueling therapy, Mike stood up without assistance. It was the first time he had been able to walk unaided. And it felt like he was reclaiming a piece of himself. His legs wobbled, but the determination in his eyes never faltered. As he took his first few steps, the one thing he wanted more than anything was to be able to walk over to Cooper, to wrap his arms around the dog who had been his lifeline through it all. Slowly, he shuffled toward Cooper, his legs trembling with effort but his heart full of gratitude. When he reached the dog, he crouched down, his knees shaking, and pulled Cooper into a tight embrace. The dog responded instantly, licking Mike's face with enthusiasm, his tail wagging furiously. Mike laughed softly, his voice still raspy but full of emotion. "You've been waiting for me, haven't you, boy?" he whispered, his hands running through the soft fur of Cooper's back. Linda and Anna, standing at a distance, watched the reunion with tears in their eyes. It was a moment that no one had expected, a moment that had seemed impossible not so long ago. But here they were, Mike, once on the brink of death, now standing on his own 2 feet, holding his faithful companion close. The love and loyalty between them was palpable, a bond that nothing, neither time nor tragedy, could ever break. As the sun began to set that evening, painting the sky in hues of gold and orange, the Reynolds family sat together on the porch. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the soft hum of cicadas filled the air. Mike sat in his favorite chair, his hand resting gently on Cooper's head. The dog's body curled at his feet. Linda sat beside him, her hand in his, her face soft with contentment. Anna sat across from them, a smile on her face, watching her parents and their loyal dog. Mike stroked the soft fur of Cooper's neck, his fingers lingering as he looked out at the horizon. "You didn't let me go, did you, buddy?" he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Cooper responded by lifting his head and resting it on Mike's lap, his eyes shining with love and loyalty. The dog's tail thumped softly against the wooden porch as if in acknowledgement. There was no need for words. The bond between them spoke volumes. No explanation needed. Linda smiled through her tears. Her heart full. She had seen so many things in her life, but nothing had ever touched her more deeply than the love between her husband and the dog. She leaned her head against Mike's shoulder and whispered, "I think you have an angel watching over you, Mike, a furry, four-legged angel." Mike chuckled softly, his fingers still stroking Cooper's fur. "I think you're right," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "He's been my guardian angel all along." For a moment, the family was silent, content in the peaceful evening. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the yard, and the sky deepened into shades of purple and pink. Mike, Linda, and Anna sat together, each of them feeling the weight of the journey they had been through, but also the immense sense of relief that came with the knowledge that they had made it to the other side. The love and devotion that had carried them through the darkest times had, in the end, brought them back to each other. The scene was one of quiet beauty, a family reunited. A man whose life had been saved by the love of his family and his loyal dog. And a dog whose devotion had never wavered. Even in the face of uncertainty. It was a reminder that there are some bonds in life that nothing can break, no illness, no distance, no time. When love is strong enough, it can bring people, and animals, back from the edge. Back from the brink of what seemed impossible. As the stars began to twinkle in the evening sky, Linda leaned over and kissed Mike on the cheek. "I'm so glad you're home," she whispered. Mike smiled, his arm wrapping around her shoulders, pulling her close. "I'm home because of you, Linda," he said, "and because of him," he added, nodding toward Cooper. The dog wagged his tail once more, his eyes sparkling with a quiet satisfaction. And in that moment, as the night settled around them, the Reynolds family knew one thing for certain: love, loyalty, and faith had brought them back together. And together, they would face whatever the future held, stronger, united, and forever bonded.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.